All right, welcome everybody. On behalf of everybody here at the Center for Brain Health, welcome to the Frontiers of Brain Health. This is where we take a deep dive into the most exciting new developments in brain research. My name is Dr. Lori Cook, and I serve as the Director of Clinical Research here at the Center. Just so everybody knows, we have both an in-person and a virtual online audience today, so we will make sure to save some time for questions at the end. So if you're in the virtual audience, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A function to submit your questions. And if you're here with us in person, just hold those in mind. Feel free to jot them down as you're listening. We'll get to as many as we can at the end. And just so you know, this presentation is also being recorded. So for those of you who don't know much about us at the Center for Brain Health, we are a cognitive neuroscience research center of the University of Texas at Dallas. We've dedicated the past 3 decades to exploring neuroplasticity and the brain's amazing lifelong potential to get stronger and work better. So now I would love to introduce you to today's speaker. So we're really fortunate to have with us here today Dr. Roozbeh Behroozmand. He's an associate professor here at the University of Texas at Dallas of speech, language, and hearing, and he's also the director of the Speech Neuroscience Lab. Dr. Behroozmand has backgrounds in biomedical engineering and neuroscience, and his research is focused on investigating the neural bases of speech production and sensory motor control in the human brain. His lab utilizes a wide range of techniques. You'll get to hear about some of them today, including things like electrophysiology, functional neuroimaging, and transcranial brain stimulation to study the sensory motor mechanisms of speech, both in healthy individuals as well as individuals who are experiencing neurological conditions. So whether that be post-stroke aphasia, Parkinson's disease, for example. So the ultimate goal of his research is to gain knowledge that can be translated into the development of novel diagnosis, clinical treatment methods, ultimately for the goal to improve speech communication and quality of life for individuals who are impacted. So thank you for being here today. Looking forward to hearing more. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Dr. Cook, for the nice introduction, and I really appreciate everybody joining us for the lecture today. And also I would like to thank the organizers for the Center for the Brain Health and also the invitation for this presentation today. So for the purpose of for this presentation, I will be providing some general introduction about an overview of the competing models of speech production and sensory motor control. And my hope is to actually present you with some of the studies that we have been conducting on individuals with post-stroke aphasia. It's a type of a speech and language impairments that is oftentimes resulting from damages to the left hemisphere of the brain, in order to better understand the underlying neurobiological sensory motor mechanisms of speech production and motor control. So I would like to start this presentation by a quote from the famous British physicist Stephen Hawking that says, "For millions of years, mankind lived just like the animals, but then something happened which unleashed the power of our imagination. We learned to talk and we learned to speak, to listen." So with this statement, I hope that we all just get the appreciation for the importance of the development of the mechanisms in the human mind that allowed us to actually use the brain systems for basically conveying linguistics messages using the movements of our speech system, articulators. So when it comes to the movement, there is a specific category of the movements that are called goal-directed movements. So as you can see on the screen, these are the type of movements that are oftentimes generated for us to either accomplish a goal or achieve the targets for a specific behaviorally relevant task. But the important thing is that movement is not only about just activating a group of muscles in our body to move, for example, the muscles of the arm or different joints. But the important part with this is that we are continuously relying on the integration of information from our sensory feedback mechanisms. That can be, for example, the visual system, the auditory system, the somatosensory system, and the integration of those information is really critical for not only learning new patterns of motor commands, but also during our daily life to recalibrate and fine-tune those types of like movements. So as you can see, a number of examples on the screen, like showing, for example, when the lady is trying to reach a cup of coffee, she's not only just moving the arm to reach that cup of coffee, but she's continuously monitoring the sensory consequences of those movements, primarily using the visual and the somatosensory system. So perhaps the models of motor control trace their roots back to the pioneer works by the Nikolai Bernstein, who was actually a scientist back in the Soviet Union, who performed like the first scientific studies in the Moscow Central Institute of Labor. He actually used a very novel methodology back then that is called the cyclographic technique to track the dynamics of the human movement. He primarily like conducted these like research studies to basically find ways for optimizing the movement patterns and productivity of the people who actually did like the manual labor work. And he, in his studies, as you can kind of like see in the picture here, he found that like any kind of like movements that we generate is basically are built on many number of like smaller movements, and if each one of these like little movements in the trajectory are altered or changed, that can actually change the overall pattern of the movement as a whole. So he has this kind of like really nice little statement that practice is a particular type of repetition without the repetition, which means basically that every time that we generate a movement, we're dealing with some level of variability in the movement, basically, apparatus, and those variabilities are actually a good thing, because those are like the signals that allow us to learn and optimize or recalibrate our basically movement patterns. One of the very interesting suggestions, pioneers like observations that he made, was that actually it appears that the central nervous system actually needs to have a way to dynamically track the dynamics of our basically movement positions and velocities. So by that, he basically thought about this idea that actually the central nervous system needs to have a way to predict the sensory consequences of our movements even before we generate them, and also based on the fact that we actually need to have a way to estimate the state, the current state of our, for example, limb position and velocity. So he came up with these like very pioneering ideas. I don't think like back then he really had any ideas about like the neurocomputational basis of how the brain actually conducts this, but this was actually a very pioneering observations that he had back then based on the studies that he conducted. So we talked about the goal-directed movement because the speech production is actually one of the most complex ways of generating goal-directed movement. So the goal of the movement for the speech production system is to allow us to actually form the pattern of the airflow that basically comes from our respiratory tract into acoustic information that actually convey linguistic messages, right? So when you think about the speech production, we are all like professional speakers because we learn how to produce a speech from early stages of the life. Most of the times when we talk, the whole process seems like very effortless and seamless, but we oftentimes like ignore the fact that the brain is actually dealing with a very complex problem of finally coordinating the sequence and time-coordinated movements of a large number of muscles in our body, probably more than 100 pairs of muscles that involve the respiratory system, the vocal apparatus, the laryngeal movement, as well as a large number of muscles in our upper vocal tract, for example, the muscles of the pharynx, the velum, the tongue movement, the jaw, facial muscles that basically help us to move our lips. So it's a relatively complex motor task that the brain needs to deal with in order to allow us to precisely turn signals into acoustic information that can actually convey linguistic messages. So I have a little kind of like short video of a person who actually produced some speech patterns in an MRI scanner, and by hopefully by showing this, we all get the appreciation about like how complex this actually function is. So we don't really see the whole story here. These are like some of the basically muscles that we kind of like see here. So for example, this is the velum muscle, like you see the tongue muscle, like down here we have the laryngeal structures. You're gonna see like the movement of the lips. But when we look at this video, if I play it for now, you're gonna kind of like see that how complex this pattern of the movement is.
Hello, my name is Timo Schnepp, and I'm going to perform a beatbox freestyle inside a real-time MRI.
So when we produce a speech, we don't oftentimes realize that we're actually controlling the movement of all these muscles in a very timely, coordinated fashion to allow us to turn the acoustic information into linguistically relevant meaning and messages for verbal communication. In terms of the neural development of the speech production, there has been like new evidence in the field corroborating the notion that actually the development of the voluntary control over the vocal motor system is perhaps one of the key components of the evolution of the human speech system. So this appears to be a very unique humane ability that allows us not to only learn new patterns of muscle movement for generating a speech and language, but also during daily life, to use the sensory feedback information to finally control and recalibrate our movement patterns. So we basically use different types of like movements to control at least two major subcategories of our speech production, which are included in, as you can see, like the segmental aspect of our speech prediction. So these are like little phonemic like units that have normally fast transitions. So these like need to be like very temporally specific patterns of the movement that we generate for example, producing different sequences of the vowel sounds and the consonants. And on top of those, we have like those like slower modulations, such as, for example, prosody, rhythm, stress, and also conveying emotional cues by a slower type of like patterns of the movement that we generate using our speech articulators. So the ability of learning and controlling motor commands is relatively actually limited in non-human primates. So a number of comparative studies in both non-human primates and humans has shown that actually oftentimes vocalizations in non-human primates are actually much more primitive compared to the complex pattern that the human speech production works. Oftentimes in non-human primates, the type of the vocalizations that they produce convey only a single meaning and are more kind of like towards like the more emotional messages. So interestingly, these like comparative studies have shown that there is actually a significant amount of overlap between the underlying neuroanatomy and the computational mechanisms of the brain system that actually involves an indirect pathway projection from cortical motor neurons in the motor cortex to basically brainstem nuclei that basically control the movement of a lot of articulator muscles for speech production via actually an indirect pathway that basically have projections from cortical motor regions to the reticular formation in the brainstem and later on to the lower motor neurons for controlling different types of like patterns of vocalizations. But this kind of like overlapping pattern of a neural circuitry for vocal production oftentimes is implicated in generating the relatively primitive type of like vocalization. So as you can see, this pathway actually mediates functions associated with like relatively innate like verbal and emotional content of vocal production for some functions such as, for example, breathing, like generating like mating calls, like coughing, crying, and laughing. But like none of these actually type of like vocalization motor control patterns compared to the complex type of like movements that we generate in our speech production system to convey linguistic messages. And interestingly, there has been evidence showing that there is actually a parallel pathway that are called the direct pathway. These are basically the pathways that are mediated through the cortical bulbar pathways, projections from the cortical motor areas of our brain directly to the lower motor neurons in the brainstem that is actually a unique like system to the human brain. And these pathways appear to be actually what provide the neurocomputational basis for voluntary and fine control of the movements for the muscles of laryngeal contraction, as well as the articulatory movement that allow us to produce a speech. So some basically major or stark like neuroanatomical differences between the non-human primates brain function as well compared to the humans. So when it comes to like the models of the speech production, there has been recently a number of competing models to describe like how speech is produced and controlled. Most of these models actually are originated from, or kind of like are inspired by the earlier models of basically dual stream mechanism that have been originally basically developed to account for the functional organization of sensory processing in the human brain. So in the brain basically. As you can see, these models basically have two distinct like pathways called the dorsal and the ventral one. So as you can see, the ventral pathways are the kind of like the so-called famous what and how pathways, right? So these are like the stream of neural information that receive projections through the ventral pathway from different sensory modalities, for example, auditory and visual domains, targeting neurons in an area of the frontal lobe that is called the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and these pathways are predominantly involved in feature processing of sensory stimuli in the environment, quality identification, the so-called like what and how pathways. However, there is another pathway called the dorsal stream pathway that basically originates from the sensory areas and actually has projections to a different subregions within the frontal cortex called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that has been in the context of the classical models of dual stream been primarily involved in spatial localization, so the so-called like where pathways. So the more recent models of speech production has emerged, like new developments that basically describe the function of speech production in the context of a dual stream model, has basically proposed two, again, anatomically distinct pathways called the ventral and dorsal. However, the dorsal stream pathway for speech production actually is conducting an additional basically neurocomputation that on top of like helping us to do localization task, this pathway is actually evolved to basically help us to integrate incoming sensory information in order to monitor and control movements associated with our speech production. So the dorsal pathway, or a stream of neural processing within the dorsal pathway, are primarily implicated in integration of sensory feedback information and using that information for speech production and motor control. Many compelling lines of evidence has shown that the dorsal stream pathway for speech sensory motor control are predominantly mediated through the functions associated with the left hemisphere. So it's a predominantly left lateralized type of network. And I will tell you later on that we actually use data in individuals like stroke survivors who have damage to the left hemisphere of the brain, oftentimes coinciding with patterns of impairment in their speech and language function, as an ideal model to better understand the underlying neural mechanisms of the dorsal stream pathway processing for speech production and sensory motor control. So two of the most recent developments in terms of the neurocomputational models that describe the function of the dorsal pathway are basically two models that basically provide like a slightly different like neurocomputational basis for speech sensory motor integration and control. The first one is as a model that is called direction into the velocity of articulators, abbreviated by the term like DIVA model, developed by Dr. Frank Gunther and his team in Boston University, that proposes basically to control subsystems for regulation of the vocal and articulatory movements. So the feed-forward system that you can kind of like see on this picture, color-coded by the little purple on the left-hand side, is a system that primarily involves like areas in the brain that are kind of like more motoric in nature. So this is the system that actually generates learned and stored sequences of trajectories. So basically generation of the motor commands that target like lower motor neurons in the brainstem area to basically tell the system what is the trajectory for different types of like movements. When I'm, for example, producing a speech, like how much should I actually move my jaw muscles? How much should I just move my tongue, or the configuration of the pharyngeal muscles, or anything with the vocal tract, right? So this is a feed-forward system that allows us to basically send some messages to our articulators and let them know about like the trajectory of the movements that needs to be produced. However, this model actually has another subsystem called the feedback that actually integrates information from primarily two major sources of feedback information. On the right-hand side, the blue color-coded box, auditory and somatosensory feedback information, in order to basically be able to monitor and perform ongoing adjustments to the muscles of the speech production in cases if there is actually an error in the production. And needless to say that this feedback system is actually really critical for us at the earliest stage of the life, when we are actually learning new patterns of speech production. So this system is actually more dominant when, for example, babies are learning how to generate new patterns of sound, when they're basically receiving information from the environment, translate them to a motoric pattern, so the babbling phase. And once the feed-forward system is calibrated, then most of the times we rely on the feed-forward system to generate the patterns of the learned sequences of vocal and articulatory movements, but the feedback system is actually supporting the system to further recalibrate and fine-tuning the patterns of the movements for speech production. The second competing model is a more recently developed model that is basically based on the principles of state feedback control. So in the context of this model, the central nervous system mechanism basically uses an internal model that is, as you can see with this like little black box in the slide, that kind of like shows the VT, or the vocal tract model. So the principle of this model is that we kind of like have an internal simulator of the dynamics of our vocal tract, meaning that we have a mental or internal representation about, if I apply these motor commands to my vocal apparatus, how am I going to actually move them, right? But this model is an internal model that actually holds an internal simulation of the vocal tract model, meaning that even prior to generation or production of a speech, if you have access to a copy of the motor commands that will eventually be applied to the vocal tract, this system allows you to have some sort of internal prediction or estimation about what is going to be the state of the articulators. Like, for example, if I apply these like commands to move my jaw, and if this is the current position of my jaw movement, how applying these motor commands are going to actually result in the movement of the jaw, and also the velocity by which I change the position of my jaw for generating different speech patterns, right? So this is actually a really groundbreaking idea, because it basically is based on the principle that we rely on this internal model simulator of our vocal tract in order to have some sort of like estimation and prediction about not only the ongoing state of the movement of our articulators, but at the same time, we can actually use this information to predict the sensory consequences of our movements, even before we generate them. So one of the really groundbreaking idea with this is that actually, as you can see here from this like little blue text here, is that the system needs to actually have access to a copy of the motor commands. So the actual motor commands will be sent to the lower motor neurons to actually move the articulators, but accessing a copy of these motor commands, oftentimes termed the efference copies, would allow the system to actually internally generate, estimate, and predict the sensory consequence of our actions. So what is the really functional significance of having access to the efference copy in these like internal predictions about the sensory consequences of our actions? Perhaps one of the most important like functional significance of this is that it allows us to actually have a predictive mechanism. So that means that before we actually generate any kind of like movement, we're going to have some sort of estimation about how this movement is going to actually result in changes in the sensory environment. Like, for example, if I'm like trying to reach for a cup of coffee, even before I start like generating these movements, I'm going to have internally an estimation about how the visual feedback from like my arm movement is going to look like before I generate it, right? So it actually helps me to have a kind of like internal model about like my interaction with the environment, right? I can actually predict the sensory consequences of my own actions when I generate them. Perceptual modulation, that's one of the other key things. Once you have an internal estimation or prediction about the sensory consequences of your action, there's actually compelling evidence that's showing that you can actually modify or modulate the pattern by which you absorb information from the environment and process them. So by having access to these internal predictions, you can actually change or modify or modulate the way your sensory systems process the feedback information from the environment. So for example, when I'm talking to you right now, the way that my auditory cortex is processing the information from my own sound is going to be actually different compared to like as if you recorded my voice and you played it back to me without me generating any speech sound. So this top-down influence of the motor system on the sensory modality can actually modulate the way that we actually perceive the world around us. And this is actually important because this internal predictions actually provide a grounding signal, a reference signal for us to not only monitor but also correct errors in our motor production by having an internal simulation system that allows us to have some sort of like estimation about the sensory consequences of our action. Having access to that reference signal, that grounding signal, allows us to compare the predicted signal with the actual sensory feedback to determine if we actually accomplish the goals of our, for example, speech movements, or there is actually some sort of like deviation that is going to be later on interpreted as an error signal that needs to be corrected. And from a kind of like more philosophical standpoint, we all know that we kind of like differentiate or distinguish the sensory consequences of our own actions compared to the things that we see in the environment or we basically process from the environment generated by anything that is not us, the external agents, right? So again, by having access to these internal predictions, the brain is going to have a kind of like a mechanism to basically distinguish between make distinguishes between the sensory consequences of our own actions relative to the ones that is actually generated by external agents. So multiple lines of evidence support the notion of an internal model and its role in the speech production. Perhaps two major lines of a study is actually one of them called the motor-induced suppression effect, or some people call it in the field of speech like a speaking-induced suppression effect. So that means that if you, for example, measure the amount of like neural activity in the cortical auditory regions during tasks when people generate sounds and they process the real-time unaltered version of their own feedback information and compare it to the condition when their own sound is basically pre-recorded and played back to them. When you compare these like neural responses in the auditory cortical region, oftentimes what you're going to find is that during the active production of a speech, you're going to see this effect that is called the suppression of neural activity in the auditory cortical region. Basically, in the context of the Efference copy system, the interpretation for these effects is that once you have access to an internal estimation about the sensory consequences of your actions, you can actually use that information to cancel out the incoming sensory information that is coming through your auditory pathway. Because basically, if you internally can have an estimation or prediction about the sensory consequences, you don't really need to conduct the additional like neurocomputations to further the processing or analyze the incoming feedback signal. So auditory suppression as a result of a motor-induced task with the speech is one line of evidence supporting the notion of having access to these internal predictions. And one of the other lines of evidence is that when people are basically exposed to alterations in the real-time feedback of their speech, which is kind of like an error for the system, the task of actually active production of the sounds actually makes the auditory system to be more sensitive to not only detect but also use these like sensory feedback errors for the motor correction of our speech production. So if you measure the same neural activity from cortical brain regions, you're going to see an elevated level of neural activity during the speaking task in response to those feedback errors compared to when they silently listen to the playback of their speech sound. So in our laboratory, what we do is actually use a very effective technique called the altered auditory feedback methodology, or AAF in abbreviation, by applying a kind of like internal, external perturbation to the feedback of speech production. So we have people basically look at some cues on the screen and just generate different speech sounds. For example, in this case, a sustained vocalization of a vowel sound for a couple of seconds. They just basically are just like saying ah for a couple of seconds. And what we do is that during their production, we apply a little perturbations to some acoustic parameters of their speech. In this case, you can alter, for example, the pitch frequency, the formative structure, the timing, the loudness. And as a result of applying these external perturbations, what we do is that we actually induce an external error to the system to basically study how the system basically reacts to these externally generated like error signals during the real-time speech production. So number of lines of evidence has shown that if you apply these perturbations to the feedback, human speakers, especially the ones that actually have normal speech, actually generate a type of vocal response that actually is compensatory in nature, meaning that if you apply these changes or unexpected perturbations to their auditory feedback of their real-time speech, they actually fight against it. If you, for example, shift the pitch frequency, as you can see on the left-hand side panel, when you shift the pitch frequency of their feedback in the downward direction, you lower the pitch of their intended production, they actually make an adjustment generating a compensatory response that actually opposes the direction of these alterations in the auditory feedback, because the system is actually a feedback loop that tries to readjust the vocal parameters in order to compensate for those applied changes. So evidence shows a strong parallels in the pattern and also the time course of both these are compensatory behavior, both in the vocal and the articulatory systems in response to these like alterations in the feedback, suggesting perhaps similar neurocomputations or homologous, if not shared, neural circuitry. So this is actually a very good objective biomarker from the behavioral perspective, because you first can use these like relatively simple behavioral measures to not only probe the integrity of the speech sensorimotor integration system. You kind of like can look at like, is there the interaction between the sensory and motor system intact? Is the system actually doing its job by generating these compensatory responses? But you can also use these behavioral measures to kind of like look at the impairment of the speech sensorimotor integration network in individuals with neurological conditions, especially those people who have speech and language disorders. So we actually, in our lab, we study these mechanisms in individuals who are stroke survivors who have coinciding language impairment associated with aphasia. So we actually try to use this very unique clinical population as an ideal model to better understand the role of the sensory motor integration systems primarily in the left hemisphere of the brain. And the kind of like the ultimate goal of this research is for us to utilize this information in order to develop targeted as well as individually tailored type of diagnosis and treatment for disorders of speech and language system. But for most of these studies, we're primarily focusing on the disorders of the speech motor system, but we also collect a lot of clinical measures of language function, and we try to better understand if there is actually a meaningful relationship between deficits at the lower level motor speech disorders, hopefully predicting some aspects of the language impairment in the higher level systems. So in terms of our research hypothesis, our primary hypothesis is that damage to the left hemispheric cortical regions in this population would result in an impairment of the underlying sensory motor integration mechanisms in the context of the dorsal stream processing network. So as we already discussed this before, this is actually the advantage of looking at these data in the context of the dorsal stream pathways, because this like neural processing within the dorsal stream pathway is shown to be more predominantly left lateralized. So looking at the stroke pattern in individuals with left hemisphere damage actually provides us with a very good model to study the underlying mechanisms of speech production and sensorimotor integration. So we actually hypothesized that this type of like impairment would result or will be accounted for by deficits in the efference copy mechanisms and the translation of those efference copies into internal predictions about the sensory consequences of our motor speech output, primarily as a result of damage to the more frontal motor speech network, as well as sensory motor integration areas, as well as deficits in the sensory, centers of the brain, primarily the auditory areas, that will result in deficits associated with the detection and basically identification of those errors, primarily associated with damages to the cortical auditory regions. So for the rest of this lecture, I'm hoping to actually present you the result of the 3 studies that we have conducted in these lines. So in the study 1, we actually recruited a group of 16 individuals with left hemisphere stroke, coinciding with like symptoms associated with post-stroke aphasia, and we kind of like matched this data with sex and gender matched neurotypical group of individuals, again like 16 people in the second group. All the individuals with post-stroke aphasia were actually tested during the chronic stage of their stroke, which is at least like 6 months following their stroke, and all of them actually completed the T1 and T2 MRI scanning for primarily the structural demarcation of the lesion in the left hemisphere. We also found that in these individuals that actually had symptoms associated with aphasia, there was actually co-occurring symptoms associated with mild to moderate symptoms associated with apraxia of the speech, which is another impairment with respect to the motor production and motor planning. All subjects passed a binaural hearing screening test because we wanted to make sure that they actually have good level of hearing ability for helping us to better understand these mechanisms by using an altered auditory feedback paradigm. In terms of the distribution of aphasia subtypes, we did not really limit ourselves to just one specific aphasia subtype, so there is actually some level of heterogeneity. As you can see, there are basically people in this population who have non-fluent aphasia, oftentimes called like the Broca's aphasia, some people with conduction, as well as unknowing. So aphasia is a type of like language impairment that coincides with many different clinical symptoms that can be associated with severe, for example, fluency disorder, not being able to produce words, or, for example, like severe auditory comprehension deficit, naming problems, repetition problems. So there's actually a wide range of clinical symptoms when it comes to symptoms with aphasia, and it's basically for each patient, it could be actually a very unique pattern of impairments. So the experimental paradigm that we use is that we actually have these individuals to look at some cues in our kind of like the sound control booth environment during the production of sustained vocalization of a vowel sound, when we apply these like little small perturbations to the auditory feedback, and we measure both the behavioral and neurophysiological responses of using EEG and MRI that I will show it to you later on. And also for each one of these trials, when they actually make the production, we have trials that are randomly interleaved between their productions, that they actually passively or silently listen to the playback of their own voice. And randomly in some trials, we're going to apply these perturbations in either up or down direction, or in some trials there's basically no perturbation or alteration as a control condition. One of the other advantages of having access to this data is that we actually had access to the lesion data in all of these individuals with a stroke, as you kind of like see here. So these are like kind of like an example of these like behavioral compensation responses, as you can see on the screen. So within the aphasia group, there's a significant amount of like variability in terms of their behavioral compensatory responses. You can identify an individual who actually generates very good like compensatory responses, similar to an average of a compensation for the control group, and you can identify individuals that actually generate almost like no responses, like almost like flat. But then there is a wide range of variability across these individuals for generating these response patterns. And we actually, by having access to their lesion data, we can actually develop some statistical models to identify the association between brain lesion as a predictor of the impairment in these compensatory motor behavior. So we can actually address the question whether or not damage to specific brain regions actually predicts the pattern of the impairment for generating these compensatory responses as a neurobiological marker of deficits in their sensorimotor integration network. This is kind of like a map of the lesion overlap across all of these individuals. So think about each one of these single images, brain images, and as an overlaid image for 16 individuals. So each one of them has a unique pattern of lesion in the left hemisphere of the brain. So we put all the 16 images together on top of each other, and we color code the frequency of lesion across different areas. So the warmer colors on these like pictures show the areas of higher level of overlap across the 16 individuals that we had, and the lighter areas or like cooler areas kind of like show like a pattern of less overlap across the population. So what we found was that there was actually a significant amount of damage, at least in 50% or more of the population in areas that are related to dorsal stream processing of the speech in accordance with the areas that the model predicts. So we actually had access to some areas that could inform us about how damage to those centers of the left hemisphere of the brain would predict impairment in the speech production and sensory motor control. So the left panel, this is like the first slide for the result of the study. As you can see, the left panel shows that actually both groups of subjects in the stroke group and control group generate these compensatory responses, meaning that when you apply these perturbations to their auditory feedback, in this case, when you shift the pitch frequency of their production in an upward direction, they actually generate compensatory responses by lowering the pitch of their voice. So that's an indication that there is actually some interaction between the sensory motor system. The black trace shows you the pattern of the responses average across the control group, and the one that is basically in red shows you for the aphasia group. So as you can see here, there is actually a statistically significantly diminished pattern of compensatory responses in the aphasia group as compared with the neurologically intact controls, perhaps as a behavioral biomarker of impaired sensory motor function in these individuals. What we conducted was that we actually looked at the pattern, like temporal specific pattern of these compensatory response deficits in relation to the pattern of the brain damage. So we actually divided the time course of the behavioral compensation to the early peak and the later phases of these compensation patterns. And what we found was that there were actually distinguishing patterns of lesion in the brain that actually predicted the time course of these behavioral compensation deficit in the aphasia group. So the earlier phases of the compensation, which is not really surprising, was actually best predicted by damage to the sensory cortical areas of the temporal lobe, which is like the primary center for auditory processing. So the very earliest stage of the whole processing is that for the auditory system to be able to detect these errors in our production and then later on translate them into a motor command for compensation. And then the areas, for example, like the inferior frontal gyrus and also supramarginal gyrus were also the lesion predictors of these impairments, patterns of behavioral impairment at the later time points. So this was the first study, but we also had some follow-up questions. So we actually kind of wondered, now we actually have some evidence about the behavioral deficits or consequences of the stroke in the left hemisphere, as we showed in the aberrantly modulated pattern of behavioral compensation. So what is actually the functional neural deficit correlates of these behavioral impairments? So how speech deficits are accounted for by the impairments of the functional neural mechanism. So we know that there are basically some level of structural abnormalities, but then how these structural abnormalities translate to a deficit in the functional mechanisms of speech production. So in order to actually create a more direct link between these lesion predictors and the functional neuroactivity, we also simultaneously measured neural activities using EEG to look at the pattern of neural activities in relevance to the biomarkers of brain lesion. So this was actually a good technique because it allowed us to actually bypass or rule out the variability associated with the behavior and establish a more direct link between the lesion in the left hemisphere stroke and the functional neuroactivity that we measure using the EEG data. So in study 2, we actually collected the data for almost like a sample size that was double compared to the previous one. So 34 participants with post-stroke aphasia were recruited for this study. Again, everybody tested during the chronic phase of a stroke, completing the MRI imaging for demarcation of the lesion. And the data was actually compared to 46 neurologically intact individuals with no history of neurological impairment or speech, language, or hearing disorders. So this is again like the map of the lesion overlap across these individuals, 34 participants and the stroke group. So you kind of like see that there is actually a significant amount of like overlap in the lesion areas that are actually directly relevant to the centers of the brain that are important for speech sensorimotor integration. So for example, you see superior temporal gyrus, you see like inferior and middle frontal gyrus, lower lambic operculum, pre and post central gyrus areas. So these are like some of the anatomical networks that are actually involved in regulating a speech function. So the first slide is like showing you the patterns of behavioral compensation. So this was actually a nice replication of our data from the previous study using a larger sample size, again showing a statistically significant pattern of diminished behavioral responses. Red is the aphasia group and blue is the control group. So as you can see, there is actually a significantly diminished pattern of behavioral speech compensation responses, again providing some preliminary behavioral evidence for the impairment of speech sensorimotor integration network across these individuals in the stroke group. When it comes to the measures of neurophysiological activity, we actually looked at or extracted event-related potential activity from the EEG data. These are neural activities that are basically collected in a time-locked patterns to the onset of different, for example, events that can be like, for example, the onset of speech production or the onset of perturbations in the auditory feedback. So on the left panel, as you can see, these are all the responses to the normal auditory feedback. So when the people basically generated these vowel sounds and there was no alteration externally in the auditory feedback of their production, the right-hand side panel shows you the responses in the control group. So our basically hypothesis or prediction was that if the system is intact, as we know from the principles of the Efference copy and internal model of the speech production, we would anticipate the responses to be significantly suppressed, speech-induced suppression effect in the control group. And that's exactly what we're seeing for several components of the ERP. As you can see in these like little red areas, we found a significant pattern of auditory suppression during the production of the vowel sounds compared to silently listening to the playback. However, when we looked at the same pattern of neural activity in the stroke group, what we found was that the stroke group also shows some level of auditory suppression, but at a much more significantly diminished magnitude of ERP modulation and also much limited in terms of the components of the ERP. So we only found it over the N1 component of the ERP activity, not in the other ones that we actually had it in the neurologically intact group. And also the level of this auditory suppression was significantly reduced. Again, sort of like providing some preliminary evidence that there is actually some level of impairment in terms of the translation of the Efference copy of the motor commands into sensory predictions for modulating the behavior of our auditory cortical neurons. And also, when we apply these perturbations, the right-hand side panel, as you can see, this is showing the responses for the control group. Again, exactly to what we predicted, we're seeing some level of enhanced neural activity for detection of the errors in the feedback compared to the listening. So some level of elevated or enhanced neural sensitivity to these changes in the auditory feedback. But again, as you can see, this pattern is significantly diminished in individuals with post-stroke aphasia. So again, some neurophysiological evidence supporting the notion of impaired sensory motor function. We also looked at the pattern of correlation between these ERP activities. The lower panel shows you the pattern of neural activity in correlation with the behavioral compensation responses, and we're finding that there is actually a meaningful relationship. There's some level of association between these like ERP measures associated or correlated with the behavioral compensation. So some of the variability in our behavioral compensation is accounted for by changes in the neural activity in the control group, but as you can see in the top panel, that association is almost completely diminished in individuals with post-stroke aphasia. So what we did next was to actually develop like lesion mapping models to identify the neural or lesion predictors of impaired neural activity as we compared, as we measured using the ARP data. So as you can see here, what we are finding is that there is actually a relatively good overlap. Is still like a distinguishable network, but some good amount of overlap in the pattern of the lesion predictors of this impaired neural activity as measured by the ERP data. So as you can see, the left panel shows you the responses during normal auditory feedback versus the altered auditory feedback on the right-hand side. As you can see, lesion to a widely distributed network within the sensory motor as well as sensory motor integration brain centers that actually very nicely fit into the predictions that we had from the dual stream model of speech, predict the impairments of ERP activity or ERP measures in a temporally specific pattern, meaning that, for example, as you can see, the kind of like the dark blue area shows like the lesion predicts for the early onset like ERP activities, and as you move forward, different color coding shows you the best lesion predictors of later ERP components. So this basically provides us with some preliminary views into the lesion biomarkers of impaired functional neural activity in the brain in a temporally specific pattern. This, again, we're identifying a widely distributed network of a speech sensory motor integration that basically account for those impairments in the neurophysiological activity. The third study that we conducted was a follow-up study that actually looked at these like measures in patients with stroke using the MRI imaging. Again, like 17 individuals with a stroke and compared to the control group. So we actually conducted the same thing with a slightly different like paradigm in the MRI scanner when people produce or listen to the playback of the speech. So the results basically, this is a good news for us because in the MRI scanner, you don't really have much of the acoustically shielded kind of like room that you have in our sound booth, but despite some level of noise in the background, because of the technology that we use, we can actually record acoustic information with a relatively good quality. So this is a replication showing that behaviorally individuals with post-stroke aphasia show this like level of impairment in their sensory motor integration data. So it's a good, nice replication of our study. So this is like the map of both signal activity in individuals with a stroke on the right-hand side and the control group on the left. So as you can see from these maps, there are areas of the brain actually lighting up in the scanner when you test them under vocalization and listening tasks with shifts versus the no shift condition in the auditory feedback. That kind of like shows relatively widely distributed networks within, for example, areas in the precentral gyrus and then the STG that kind of like light up when you have these people like conducting these speech tasks, as compared to the stroke group that kind of like show almost like no activity in the left hemisphere, but relatively limited activity over the right hemisphere, primarily related to areas for motor speech production. This is the kind of like the slide that kind of like shows we actually developed a full model for the analysis of the data, and we looked at different contrasts. What we're showing here is the contrast that actually looked at the group differences in terms of the both signal activity. What we're finding is that there is actually a significantly reduced amount of like both signal activity in the left hemisphere, and again a widely distributed network in accordance to what the dorsal stream pathway model basically predicted in individuals with post-stroke aphasia compared with the controls. Primarily, this effect was more evident during the active vocal production, but there is actually some residual effect in the listening task, but we use very stringent criteria for looking at these effects, and I think part of the limitation with this study is that we still have a relatively small sample size, so we're hoping to be able to collect more data at the Center for Brain Health at University of Texas at Dallas to kind of like increase the sample size for this study. When we looked at the contrast between vocalization versus listening, again, we identified that there are actually distinguishable pattern of neural activity over the cortical motor areas that light up in the scanner for individuals in the control group. But again, when you look at the same pattern in individuals with post-stroke aphasia, the left hemisphere is almost like silence, and you see some limited pattern of neural activity in the right hemisphere, predominantly over the dorsal area of the precentral gyrus in response to these speech tasks. There's some level of correlation in basically between the behavioral measures and neural activity measured in different regions, for example, the STG inferior frontal gyrus, that account for some level of variability in the behavioral compensation. So we're really excited about this data, and we're kind of like working on new data analysis to look at the correlation in the whole brain analysis map to identify the brain regions that basically predict these patterns of correlations. And this is all the data within the control group. When you look at the same pattern of activity in the aphasia group, you don't really see much of the correlation, meaning that there is perhaps the disruption of the sensorimotor networks resulting from a stroke is actually impairing the system for making those predictions. So to summarize, we actually found that our findings support the notion of an impaired speech sensory motor control in aphasia, evidenced by the diminished compensatory responses. The EEG and neuroimaging data revealed that this neural deficits basically show an aberrantly modulated pattern of neural activity in a widely distributed sensory motor network in the brain, and these data further corroborate the notion of a dorsal stream pathway processing for speech sensory motor integration. One thing that I haven't really shown you here is that we're actually identifying some pattern of correlation between our behavioral measures of a speech compensation with the clinical measures of language production. And what we're finding is that there's a specific subcategories of clinical measures of a speech language production, primarily the repetition, that are actually best predicted by these behavioral measures. So that gives us hope that better understanding the underlying neural mechanisms of sensory motor integration deficit can help us to better understand at least some aspects of language impairment for the development of targeted diagnosis and treatment in these individuals. Some limitations commonly with all these studies is that we have lesion predictors that are actually only limited to a specific like cerebrovascular perfusion bed, so we don't have lesion data in some other areas that might be involved in the speech production. But then again, and also white matter changes. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to skip over these parts. I'm just going to quickly tell you about a number of studies that we're excited to do. One of them is actually visual feedback training. So I'm just going to briefly show you this video that we have developed a system that actually can show people like little visual markers on the screen that they can actually control it using their speech. So we can actually train them to practice on their speech production by basically moving some cursors, like visual cursors on the screen, and we can define some targets on them. This is like a video, but we have kind of like a similar model of this in our lab. So you kind of like see that little dot on the screen that kind of like can be modulated when the patient actually is doing the task. This is actually intraoperative recording. Define another target region that they need to track with their voice production. Right? So we're hoping to be able to use this very simple training paradigm to improve their. So this is like one of the paradigms. We have evidence. One of the students in our lab, Marissa Olson, actually did this and showed that we can actually modulate the pattern of behavioral compensation in control people. We're excited to actually extend this line of work to post-stroke aphasia. One of the other things, Ilun Zhang, one of the doctoral students in our lab, actually conducted a study to look at the effect of cognitive attention. If you train people to pay more attention to the auditory feedback, how this actually changes their pattern of speech motor control. We have evidence from both behavior and neurophysiology showing that we can actually modulate these patterns of behavioral and neurophysiological responses by an attentional instructional training for these individuals. Brain stimulation is another very viable type of technique, as well as neurofeedback training. And also combination of neurophysiology and neuroimaging techniques, MRI and EEG, would be hopefully providing us a lot of comprehensive information in the future. So I started this presentation by a quote from Stephen Hawking. I want to end it with one from him. It says, "Speech has allowed the communication of ideas, enabling human beings to work together to build the impossible. Mankind's greatest achievements have come about by talking, and its greatest failures by not talking." So all we need to do is to make sure that we keep talking. And thank you very much. So this is the acknowledgement slide for our lab and the collaborators at University of South Carolina and UC Irvine. These are all the current lab members, including Kaylee Ray, our fantastic speech pathologist who is sitting in the audience right here, and our postdoctoral doctoral students, and also some of the former labs. And thanks to the funding from the NIDC, DDNIH. And some of the pictures show that we actually sometimes have fun in the lab. So we do picnic events and different things. Thank you very much for your time, and I apologize. And I apologize for going a little over time. Thank you so much for your
Well, thank you so much. I think we still have time for just a couple of questions. Let me go ahead and ask one of the questions from our virtual audience, if that's all right. I know you spoke today about post-stroke aphasia, but there was a curiosity about, are there any implications to help us better understand or address disfluency in other conditions? They specifically asked about traumatic brain injury, for example.
Absolutely, that's a great question. So I think these behavioral markers in general allow us to tap into the question of what subsystem within the speech sensory motor network might be impaired. So we have measures to kind of look at the neurobiological origin of the impairment. Is the impairment primarily coming from deficits in sensory feedback processing, or is it predominantly a motor deficit, as individuals with this disfluency may have, or is it the problem not necessarily a motor related or sensory related, but it's basically because of the broken interaction or the link between the sensory motor loop. So I think these paradigms will actually have the advantage of informing us about the underlying neural basis of both the sensory and motor integration mechanism, with application of studying these systems in other clinical populations to address their clinical needs.
Excellent, thank you. Any questions here in the room? Yes.
Hi, I have a question. I think you were starting to address it with your study 2 and 3, but I'm curious, do you think that you're looking at one big error detection system that's detecting errors in pitch and articulation and all that, or do you think with that wide distribution in the imaging that maybe you're seeing multiple sort of sub-error detection systems?
That's a great question. So we now have some recent developments in terms of the models that talk about two anatomically distinct and yet overlapping patterns of neural processing for primarily vocal production versus articulation. So this is the new model that has recently been published, a paper on it that talks about a dual coordination system, that there are distinct pattern of anatomical regions that predict the impairment in our vocal apparatus versus the articulatory movement. So when we talk about the evolution of a speech production system, we know that we primarily had to rely on our vocal apparatus for generating sound. The movement of the articulatory system is an overlaid function that we kind of magically developed in our brain to move the vocal tract for converting those sounds into meaningful units of a speech. So I think we are going to learn more about the anatomical contribution of the functional contribution of different anatomical regions in the brain in terms of their role in distinct pattern of regulation of our vocal motor control versus articulatory movement. We have some ideas, and also there seem to be differential contribution of auditory versus somatosensory feedback for each one of these systems. And I think we have some ideas about the role of the auditory system probably is more prominent for vocal motor control, probably somatosensory being more involved in regulation of our vocal apparatus, for example, the jaw movement, the tongue movement. I think as we move forward in the field, we're going to learn more about it. We have some ideas right now that can be helpful based on the studies that we do. We know right now that is when we look at these measures, we actually have collected some data when we had these individuals not to only just generate a vowel sound, but actually produce a word. And we applied, instead of the pitch perturbation, we applied formant perturbations to look at the pattern of articulatory compensation. And behavioral data shows that we actually have evidence showing that applying these perturbations to the feedback also induces compensation in the vocal motor system, but we are still in the process of analyzing that data from a neurophysiological standpoint to better understand the commonalities and differences in terms of what is the underlying neural mechanism for regulating vocal versus articulatory movement.
Thanks, and I think one final question here from Sandy.
So I have maybe two questions, but it depends on how long his answer is.
Sure.
The first question is, do you feel like that both of these systems are disrupted at the same time, or do you think there could be a sequence of my vocal motor is impaired and then I'm quickly changing my sensory feedback, so it's more sequential versus both and at the same time?
I think that's an excellent question. I don't really know the exact answer to this question. My general speculation is that when you have an impairment, let's say a damage to a part of the brain, sometimes we just look at it from the perspective of lesion, like what is the gray matter predictor of that? But we need to take into account that when there is an area in the brain like being affected by stroke, you're actually going to deal with a lot of disruption in the white matter tract connectivity. So I think it's actually a system-wide deficit that can extend to both sensory and motor impairments, but with like utilizing this like methodology that we have in the lab, we can at least to some extent tease apart the contribution of sensory processing versus motor processing, or maybe sometimes it's not either sensory or motor, but it might be because of the disconnection in the link, right? So we're hoping to be able to run actually some connectivity analysis on these like measures that we have, and I'm really looking forward to work with people here at the CBH to collect more MRI data, both functional and structural, to better understand these mechanisms. But my take is like, every part that gets affected, we think about it as a big system, it might induce actually a system-wide deficit that can eventually translate to the impairments of these like behavioral compensation responses.
So my last question, just real quick then, is based on that, do you think an intervention that approaches both at the same time might be more effective than either or?
That's again another perfect question. I think we're working on better understanding first what is the source of the deficit. So if you find out, like for example, because we see like a lot of a wide variety of like symptoms in these individuals in terms of their motor behavior as well as the language symptoms. So it might be the case that for some patients in this group, it might be more a sensory deficit. So maybe in the clinical work we can focus more on the sensory aspect of their speech error detection, and that can lead to better correction. And for some of them, it might be more of a motoric thing. So classically in the clinic, I think the focus has been like more on the motor aspect of the production, but now we're learning that is actually a sensory motor deficit. So we need to pay more attention on the sensory side as well. Yes.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of these very meticulous findings with us.
So much. Appreciate it.
Excited to see the work to come. And thank you all for joining us today. We encourage you to join us next Friday, September 27, as we are going to be joined by Dr. Natalia Rost, who is a cognitive neuroscientist looking at outcome prediction after acute stroke using tools like neuroimaging, genetics. So I think it's going to be a great talk as well. And if you want to become more acquainted with the Center for Brain Health and have not yet taken our Great Brain Gain Text Challenge, we encourage you to try that. You can scan the QR code on the screen there, and we invite you to take part in that. Thank you again today, and I wish you all a great weekend.
Thank you.